In the winter of 1637, a Dutch sailor sat down in a warehouse for a quick breakfast. He saw what looked like an onion lying on the counter, sliced it up, and ate it with a side of herring. He did not know it, but he had just eaten a breakfast that cost the equivalent of a modern-day mansion. That was not an onion. It was a Semper Augustus tulip bulb. This is not a fairy tale about flowers. This is the story of the first time in human history that greed completely defeated logic. Before Bitcoin, before the dot-com crash, before the housing crisis, there was the tulip. This is the story of how the most sensible people on Earth, the Dutch, went insane, traded their life savings for a dying plant, and invented the financial crash. To understand the madness, you have to walk the streets of Amsterdam in the Golden Age. Forget the postcards of cute bicycles and sunny canals. The Amsterdam of the 1630s was a gritty, industrial engine that ran on seawater and avarice. It was a city built on mud, constantly fighting back the ocean, where the sky was a perpetual sheet of gray steel and the rain chilled you to the bone. But beneath the gloom, the city was burning with a different kind of heat. It was the wealthiest place on the planet, the center of a global trade web that stretched from the icy Baltic to the steaming jungles of Indonesia. The air in the harbor did not smell like flowers. It smelled of tar, wet rope, and the intoxicating aroma of spices worth more than their weight in gold. Massive wooden ships from the Dutch East India Company, the legendary VOC, docked daily, their hulls groaning under the weight of nutmeg, cloves, pepper, and silk. These were not just commodities, they were winning lottery tickets. A successful voyage to the East Indies could return a profit of 400%, creating a class of merchants with pockets so deep they did not know how to empty them. Money was not just flowing through the city, it was flooding the basements. But this explosion of wealth created a psychological fracture in the Dutch mind. These people were Calvinists, strict Protestants who believed in modesty, sobriety, and the absolute rejection of vanity. They dressed in severe black robes with stiff white collars, walking through their marble-floored mansions like funeral directors. They were terrified that their success was a sign of sin, yet they could not stop making money. They were trapped in a paradox of guilt and gold. They needed a way to display their status that did not violate their religious code, something that was technically natural and therefore God-given. Into this repressed, pressure cooker society arrived a stranger from the East. The tulip was not native to the soggy soil of the Netherlands. It was a wild, rugged immigrant from the dry steppes of Central Asia and the gardens of the Ottoman Empire. When it first appeared in Europe in the late 16th century, it was a shock to the system. European flowers were polite and boring, roses and lilies that sat quietly in the background. The tulip was different. It was arrogant, upright, and saturated with colors so intense they looked like spilled paint. It stood tall on a single sturdy stem, demanding attention, opening its petals to the sun like a chalice. It did not look like a plant. It looked like a jewel that had been pulled from the earth. For the wealthy merchant class, it was love at first sight. Collecting these exotic bulbs became the ultimate status symbol, a way to signal to your neighbors that you were not only rich, but also cultured and connected to the wider world. It was the 17th century equivalent of parking a limited edition Ferrari in your driveway, but better because you could claim it was an appreciation of God as creation. The obsession started at the top, in the manicured gardens of the aristocracy and the botanical societies of Leiden. It was a gentleman's hobby, a refined pursuit for men who spoke Latin and understood botany. They cataloged the varieties with obsessive precision, giving them names that sounded like royalty: the admiral, the general, the viceroy. But the most coveted flowers were the ones that defied the laws of nature. Most tulips are solid-colored, red, yellow, white, but occasionally a flower would bloom with spectacular, flame-like streaks of contrasting color. These broken tulips were the holy grail of the garden. They looked like marble statues or flags caught in the wind, with intricate patterns of crimson on white or purple on yellow. They were breathtakingly beautiful, and they were impossibly rare. A grower could plant 1,000 bulbs and only get one that displayed these magnificent breaks. They were unique, unrepeatable works of art painted by nature itself. But there was a dark irony hiding inside the petals, a secret that 17th-century science could not possibly understand. The beauty was a symptom of a disease. The flame patterns were caused by the Mosaic Virus, a plant infection spread by the humble peach potato aphid. The virus interfered with the flower's ability to produce solid color, breaking the pigment into those stunning, jagged streaks. The most valuable object in the world was actually a dying thing, struggling to survive a sickness that made it smaller and weaker with every generation. This biological reality created a supply shock that no amount of money could solve. You could not manufacture a tulip bulb in a factory, and you certainly could not manufacture a broken one. You had to plant a seed and wait 7 to 12 years for it to bloom, praying that the virus would strike in just the right way. The supply was fixed by the slow, grinding pace of the seasons, but the demand was about to become infinite. For a while, the trade remained a closed loop, a polite exchange between rich men in velvet coats. But secrets in a city as dense as Amsterdam do not stay secret for long. The middle class, the weavers, the carpenters, the bakers began to peer over the garden fences of the elite. They saw the money changing hands. They saw that a single root, no bigger than a garlic clove, could trade for the price of a carriage. They looked at their own hard lives, their calloused hands, and their slow, honest wages, and they felt the itch. A dangerous idea began to take root in the minds of the common people. They realized that you did not need to enjoy the beauty of the flower to make money from it. You just needed to own the bulb for a little while before selling it to a greater fool. The tulip was ceasing to be a flower and starting to become a financial instrument. The garden gates were about to burst open, and the chaos of the marketplace was waiting to rush in. The virus was not just in the plant anymore. The greed was infecting the population, and unlike the aphid, this contagion moved fast. But nature has a way of ruining a good party, and the tulip trade had a serious logistical problem that should have stopped the mania cold. A tulip bulb is a living thing with a strict biological clock. It can only be safely removed from the ground during the dormant months of late summer and early autumn. If you dig it up in the spring while it is blooming, or in the winter while it is rooting, you kill the plant and destroy your investment. For a rational market, this would mean that trading could only happen for a few weeks a year, leaving the rest of the calendar for honest work. But the Dutch were done with being rational, and they certainly were not going to let a little thing like biology get in the way of a fortune. Greed is the mother of invention, and to bypass the seasons, the speculators invented a new kind of financial magic that would haunt the world for centuries. They stopped trading the physical bulbs and started trading the rights to the bulbs. They created futures contracts, notarized scraps of paper that promised delivery of a specific tulip 6 months later when the ground thawed. The Dutch called it Windhandel or wind trade, a poetic and cynical name that perfectly captured the reality of what was happening. They were buying and selling air, trading ghosts of flowers that were currently sleeping under 3 feet of freezing mud. With the physical limitations removed, the market did not just expand, it mutated. The trade moved out of the refined botanical gardens of the aristocracy and descended into the sticky, smoke-filled underbelly of the city. The new stock exchange was not a marble hall. It was the back room of the local tavern. Every town in the Netherlands, from Haarlem to Utrecht, saw its local inns converted into makeshift trading floors. These were not places for quiet contemplation. They were dens of noise, vice, and adrenaline, where the air was thick with the blue haze of pipe smoke and the sour reek of stale beer. These tavern-based markets were organized into loose associations called colleges, but do not let the academic name fool you into thinking there was any scholarship involved. A college was just a group of local drunks and dreamers who met 2 or 3 times a week to gamble on flower prices. They developed their own secret language, their own handshakes, and their own bizarre rituals to grease the wheels of commerce. There were no lawyers present to review the contracts, and there were no judges to enforce them. The only authority in the room was the provost, a master of ceremonies elected by the drinkers to keep the peace and manage the flow of alcohol. The trading mechanism itself was designed to maximize pressure and minimize thought. They did not use an auctioneer. They used a system of slate tablets and secret signals. A buyer and a seller would sit opposite each other, often surrounded by a cheering crowd, and scratch numbers onto a wooden slate. If they could not agree, they would erase the chalk and pass the slate back and forth, haggling in silence until a price was struck or the deal collapsed. It was a primal, psychological combat fueled by ego and intoxication. Crucially, every trade required the payment of wine money, Windhandel, a mandatory tip that went towards buying rounds of drinks for everyone in the room. This was not a small fee. It could be substantial, sometimes amounting to the price of a sheep. The genius of the system was evil in its simplicity. The more you traded, the more everyone drank. The more everyone drank, the more reckless the bids became. The wine money turned the market into a self-reinforcing feedback loop of intoxication. Sobriety was the enemy of the trade, so the system ensured that no one stayed sober for long. The barrier to entry for this casino was effectively zero. In the old days, you needed gold to buy a bulb. In the age of the wind trade, you did not need a single guilder. You just needed a signature and a reputation that was not currently in the gutter. A man could walk into a tavern with empty pockets, buy a contract for a Viceroy tulip due for delivery in June, and walk out promising to pay 3,000 guilders that he did not have. He was not worried about the debt because he had no intention of ever taking delivery of the flower. His plan, and the plan of every other soul in that smoke-choked room, was to sell that piece of paper to someone else next week for 3,500 guilders. The contract became a hot potato, passed from hand to hand, rising in value with every exchange, while the actual bulb rotted in the ground, completely unaware of the chaos it was causing. It created a bizarre economic chain where a weaver bought a bulb from a miller who bought it from a chimney sweep, and none of them had the money to settle the bill. They were buying 100 bulbs with money they did not have from a man who did not own the bulbs to sell to a third man who could not afford them. As the winter of 1636 set in, the prices detached themselves from reality and floated into the stratosphere. Because no actual money was changing hands, only promises, it felt like playing with monopoly money. It is psychologically much easier to sign a piece of paper for a year's wages than it is to physically count out the gold coins. The abstraction of the debt desensitized the population to the risk. A farmer would look at his cows, tangible, milk-producing assets that had fed his family for generations, and see them as boring, slow capital. He would sell the livestock, sell the land, and take the cash to the tavern to buy a single piece of paper with a fancy name on it. Carpenters sold their tools, the very means of their livelihood, to get a stake in the game. Weavers let their looms gather dust because weaving cloth paid pennies, while trading wind paid fortunes. The Calvinist work ethic, the bedrock of Dutch success, evaporated overnight. Why work 12 hours a day in the freezing rain when you could make a lifetime's earnings over a pint of ale on a Tuesday night? The entire country was gripped by a collective delusion that they had discovered a perpetual motion machine for wealth. They believed that the price of tulips could only go up, that there was an infinite line of foreigners waiting at the docks to buy these bulbs at any price. By late 1636, the mania had penetrated every layer of society. It was not just the merchants anymore. It was the maidservants, the footmen, and the street peddlers. The price of a single bulb could double in a week. A bulb that traded for 40 guilders in November might trade for 100 in December and 500 in January. The charts, if they had existed, would have looked like a vertical wall. There was no fundamental reason for this. The tulips had not become rarer. The Dutch had just become crazier. And sitting at the very top of this mountain of madness was the Semper Augustus. If the lesser tulips were the currency of the common man, the Semper Augustus was the crown jewel, the nuclear weapon of the flower world. It was a flower of such staggering beauty, white petals slashed with crimson blood stripes, that only about a dozen bulbs existed in the entire country. It was the ultimate prize, the symbol of the impossible peak. As the new year of 1637 approached, the price for a single Semper Augustus bulb reached 10,000 guilders. To put that in perspective, that was enough money to feed, clothe, and house a Dutch family for half a lifetime. It was the price of a grand canal house in the best district of Amsterdam, all for a root that you could crush in your hand. The stage was set for the final act. The balloon was inflated to the point of bursting, and the needle was already in the room. The canals of Amsterdam were frozen solid in January 1637, the ice thick enough to support the weight of a horse and cart, but the financial thermometer of the city had shattered the glass and was boiling over. It was a winter of biting cold, where the wind off the North Sea could freeze the breath in your lungs, yet the population was sweating in a fever dream of avarice. The normal rhythms of day and night had ceased to exist in the trading towns. In the taverns of Haarlem and Hoorn, the candles burned down to the nub and were immediately replaced, illuminating faces that had not seen a pillow in 48 hours. The market had gone vertical, defying every law of gravity and logic that had governed human commerce since the invention of the coin. Prices did not just double. They mutated, jumping by huge percentages between the first tankard of ale and the last. A contract bought at breakfast for the price of a carriage could be sold at dinner for the price of a house. The speed of the turnover was nauseating, a blur of shouting voices and scratching slate pencils that drowned out the church bells outside. There was no time to think, no time to analyze the fundamentals, and certainly no time to ask why a root was suddenly worth more than a lifetime of labor. You either bought now, or you stayed poor forever. The fear of missing out was a physical pain, a sharp hook in the gut of every citizen who watched their neighbor walk into a tavern pauper and walk out a prince. To understand the sheer scale of this insanity, we have to look at the receipts. History has preserved a specific bill of sale for a single bulb of the Viceroy variety, and reading it today feels like reading a fiction written by a madman. The buyer did not pay in gold. He paid in commodities, a barter of real, life-sustaining goods exchanged for a decorative plant. For one Viceroy bulb, he traded 2 laths of wheat and 4 laths of rye, enough grain to feed a village for a season. But that was just the appetizer. He added 4 fat oxen, beasts of burden that represented the industrial machinery of the age. He threw in 8 fat swine and 12 fat sheep, a literal herd of livestock that provided meat, wool, and leather. He added 2 hogsheads of wine and 4 tons of beer, enough alcohol to keep a tavern drunk for a month. He piled on 2 tons of butter and 1,000 pounds of cheese, a mountain of dairy that would take a warehouse to store. Finally, he topped off the pile with a silver drinking cup, a suit of fine clothes, a bed with its mattress and bedding, and a ship to carry it all. Pause for a second and visualize that pile of goods. Picture the mooing cattle, the bleating sheep, the mountain of cheese, the heavy barrels of wine, and the actual sailing ship docked in the harbor. All of that tangible, useful, survival-grade wealth was handed over for a single, small, brown lump of vegetable matter that weighed less than a dead mouse. It was a trade that stripped a man of everything he needed to live in exchange for something he could only look at. If aliens were watching Amsterdam in January 1637, they would have assumed the species had suffered a collective stroke. This economic anarchy turned the social pyramid on its head. The rigid class structure of the 17th century, where a man was born into his station and stayed there until he died, dissolved in the solvent of the mania. The poor were suddenly rich, and the rich were paralyzed by envy. There is a famous account of a chimney sweep, a man who spent his life crawling through the blackened flues of the wealthy, inhaling soot and living in squalor. He took his meager savings, made a lucky bet in the futures market, and emerged with a contract worth a fortune. He did not put the money in the bank. He walked straight into a high-end draper's shop, still covered in the grime of his trade. He pointed a blackened finger at the finest red wool and silk, materials reserved for the nobility, and bought enough to have a suit tailored like a king. He marched through the streets, a walking contradiction of soot and silk, a symbol of a world where labor was for idiots and speculation was for geniuses. In the taverns, the masters found themselves pouring drinks for their own footmen. The servants had the cash, so the servants called the shots. The old money looked at the new money with a mixture of disgust and terror, realizing that their ancestral estates were being outperformed by a gardener with a gambling addiction. But the peak of the mountain, the trade that stands as the monument to this madness, involved the legendary Semper Augustus. As the supply of this emperor of flowers was so limited, the price became theoretical, a number so high it lost all meaning. In the final weeks of the boom, a single Semper Augustus bulb was exchanged for 12 acres of prime building land in the center of a Dutch city. 12 acres. This was not farmland in the middle of nowhere. This was urban real estate in one of the densest, most valuable economic zones on Earth. Visualize a massive plot of land, big enough to build a neighborhood, a legacy that would generate rent and shelter for centuries. A family could live on the income from that land for generations. And it was traded for a root that could rot, a root that could be eaten by a mouse, a root that, if you dropped it on the cobblestones, would shatter. The permanence of land was swapped for the fragility of a flower. It was the ultimate triumph of the ephemeral over the eternal. Why did not they stop? Why did not anyone stand up on a table and scream that the emperor had no clothes? The answer is the greater fool theory. Deep down, the chimney sweep and the baker and the merchant probably knew that a tulip was not worth a ship or a farm. But they did not care about the tulip. They cared that there was someone else, a greater fool, who would pay even more next week. They convinced themselves that the party would last forever because the world was waking up to the beauty of the flower. They told themselves stories about rich kings from France and princes from Germany who were supposedly en route to Amsterdam with chests full of gold, desperate to buy these bulbs at any price. The Dutch believed they were front-running a wave of global demand. They were not buying a flower. They were buying a ticket to the front of the line. They were smart. The foreigners were the marks. It was a beautiful lie that allowed them to sleep at night while holding contracts worth more than their souls. As February 1st, 1637 rolled around, the market was screaming at a pitch that only dogs could hear. The prices were at their absolute mathematical peak. A routine auction was scheduled for February 3rd in the city of Haarlem, a major hub of the flower trade. Everyone expected another record-breaking day. They sharpened their slate pencils and prepared their bids, dreaming of the mansions they would buy and the ships they would commission. Nobody knew it was the last day, but there was a grim backdrop to this carnival of greed. The bubonic plague, the Black Death, was creeping through the cities of the Netherlands that winter. In Haarlem, the death bells were ringing almost as often as the trading bells. The presence of death added a nihilistic edge to the gambling. If you might be dead in a week, why not bet the farm? Why save for a retirement you might never see? The plague whispered in their ears that life was short, so the party had to be loud. They danced on the edge of the grave, clutching their future's contracts, unaware that the music was about to stop and the lights were about to go out. On the morning of February 3rd, 1637, the sun struggled to break through the gray winter clouds hanging over Haarlem, but inside the local tavern, the air was hot, stagnant, and smelled of stale beer and nervous sweat. This was a routine auction, one of dozens happening across the Netherlands that week, and the mood should have been festive. The tables were packed with men who had become rich on paper in the last month, their eyes scanning the room for the next opportunity to double their money. The auctioneer stood on a crate at the front of the room, a gavel in one hand and a basket of bulbs in the other. He was not selling the legendary Semper Augustus today. He was selling a pound of Wit Kronen, a standard white tulip that was the bread and butter of the trade. He cleared his throat, smoothed his apron, and opened the bidding at 1,250 guilders, a price that would have been considered a bargain just 2 days prior. He looked out at the sea of faces, his pen hovering over the ledger, waiting for the shout that always came. He waited for the raised hand, the nod, the signal that the game was still on. But for the first time in 3 years, the only sound in the room was the crackle of the fire in the hearth. No one moved. The men who had been screaming for contracts the night before were suddenly studying their boots or staring intently at the bottom of their tankards. The auctioneer, assuming it was a negotiation tactic, lowered the price to 1,100 guilders. The silence stretched out, heavy and suffocating, transforming the tavern from a marketplace into a funeral parlor. He dropped it to 1,000, then 800. Still, there was nothing. The terror did not hit the room all at once. It crept in slowly, like cold water rising around their ankles. The buyers looked at each other, and in that shared glance, the spell was broken. They realized simultaneously that the greater fool was not coming through the door. There was no one left to buy. The music had stopped, and there were no chairs left. Panic is a contagion, and it moves faster than any virus. It started with a whisper in the back of the room. There are no buyers. That single sentence dismantled the entire psychological architecture of the market. Men who had been drinking and laughing 10 minutes earlier were now rushing for the exits, desperate to find a buyer, any buyer before the news spread. But the news was faster than they were. Messengers jumped on horses, whipping the animals into a froth as they galloped toward Amsterdam, Alkmaar, and Leiden. They were not carrying gold or goods. They were carrying the information that the world had ended. By the time the sun set on February 3rd, the infection of fear had paralyzed the entire country. The crash did not happen as a slow decline. It was a vertical drop into the abyss. The logic of the wind trade turned against its creators with brutal efficiency. When you buy a contract for future delivery, you are betting on the future. When the future is canceled, the contract becomes a death warrant. The prices did not just fall to their pre-mania levels, they evaporated. A bulb that was worth 5,000 guilders at breakfast was worth absolutely nothing by dinner. It was not that the price had dropped to 50 guilders. It was that you could not give the bulb away for free. This vaporization of wealth was difficult for the human mind to comprehend because the loss was invisible. A merchant who had gone to bed a millionaire woke up a pauper, yet his house looked the same, his clothes looked the same, and the coins in his pocket were unchanged. What had vanished was the promise of wealth, the paper fortune that he had leveraged his entire life against. It was like waking up from a lucid dream and realizing that the gold bars in your hands were just dry leaves. The realization was nauseating. Men stood on the canal bridges, staring into the dark water, trying to do the math that would save them, but the numbers always came up zero. The social contract dissolved as quickly as the financial one. The taverns, which had been the joyous centers of the colleges, turned into battlegrounds. Sellers who held signed contracts hunted down their buyers, grabbing them by the collars of their expensive coats and screaming for payment. "You signed the paper," they yelled, waving the notarized documents that were now just evidence of their own stupidity. "You owe me 3,000 guilders." But the buyers fought back with the desperation of drowning men. "I do not have the money," they screamed back. "Take the bulb." "I do not want it." "Keep the damn flower." But nobody wanted the flower. The tulip, which had been a jewel, a status symbol, and a retirement plan, was suddenly toxic. To own a bulb was to admit you were the sucker. The physical object itself became a symbol of shame. In the streets, people began to trample on the flower beds they had tended so carefully only weeks before. The anger was visceral. It was the rage of a gambler who realizes the casino was rigged, only to remember that he was the one who shuffled the deck. The trust that held the Dutch economy together, the Calvinist belief that a man's word was his bond, shattered under the weight of impossible debts. Adding to the apocalyptic atmosphere was the grim reality of the bubonic plague, which had been simmering in the background of the mania like a dark baseline. Now, as the economy collapsed, the disease seemed to surge, as if nature was piling on the misery. While men were going bankrupt in the taverns, their neighbors were dying in their beds. The bell ringers were exhausted, tolling for the financial dead during the day and the physical dead during the night. The smell of vinegar and burning herbs, used to ward off the sickness, mixed with the smell of spilled ale and fear. For the strict Calvinists, this was not just a market correction. It was divine judgment. They believed that God was punishing the Netherlands for its vanity, for worshiping a flower instead of the Creator. The preachers took to the pulpits, thundering that the crash was the wrath of the Almighty, a scourge sent to cleanse the land of its greed. The psychological weight of this was crushing. The Dutch did not just feel broke, they felt damned. They had gambled with their souls and lost, and now the plague carts were rattling over the cobblestones to collect the bill. The chaos inevitably spilled into the courts, creating a legal gridlock that threatened to destroy the state. Within days, thousands of lawsuits were filed. Every seller sued every buyer. Every creditor sued every debtor. The sheer volume of litigation paralyzed the judicial system. The judges, many of whom had speculated on tulips themselves, looked at the pile of cases with horror. They faced an impossible dilemma. If they enforced the contracts, half the population would go to debtor's prison, and the economy would grind to a halt. If they declared the contracts void, they would be legalizing theft and destroying the sanctity of the law. The government in The Hague watched the meltdown with growing panic. They realized that the free market had failed so spectacularly that it could not fix itself. There was no invisible hand coming to save them. There was only a fist fight in every tavern in the country. The magistrates knew they had to intervene, but how do you legislate the aftermath of a mass delusion? How do you unwind 1 billion guilders of imaginary money? They had to make a choice between justice and survival, and as the riots began to spread from the inns to the town squares, they knew they were running out of time. The Dutch Golden Age was in danger of ending in a muddy, bankrupt brawl. The government in The Hague finally stepped in, not with a bailout, but with a bucket of cold water. The magistrates looked at the mountain of lawsuits threatening to bury the Dutch legal system and realized that trying to untangle every individual knot of greed was impossible. If they enforced the contracts, half the population would be thrown into debtor's prison, and the other half would be bankrupt trying to feed them. So, the high courts made a decision that was as brilliant as it was cynical. They reclassified the entire tulip trade. They declared that the buying and selling of futures contracts was not commerce in the eyes of the law. It was gambling. This legal sleight of hand changed everything instantly. Under Dutch law, gambling debts were debts of honor, meaning they were not enforceable in a court of justice. If you sold a bulb and the buyer refused to pay, you could not sue him. The judge would simply look at your contract, shrug, and tell you that you should have been more careful at the card table. The state effectively washed its hands of the entire mess, stepping back to let the market rot in the sun. It was a brutal simplification that saved the institution of the court but sacrificed the concept of justice. To prevent total anarchy in the streets, the city councils proposed a compromise, a messy bandage for a severed limb. They suggested that all contracts signed during the mania could be voided if the buyer paid a cancellation fee of 3.5% to the seller. The math was a slap in the face to anyone who had actually produced something of value. If you had agreed to buy a bulb for 1,000 guilders, you could now walk away from the deal by throwing 35 guilders at the furious seller. It was a get-out-of-jail-free card for the reckless speculators who had driven the prices to the moon. For the buyers, the weavers, the chimney sweeps, the drunkards who had bid fortunes they did not have, this was a miracle. They had stared into the abyss of total ruin, and the government had pulled them back for the price of a few rounds of drinks. They scraped together the cancellation fees, dissolved their contracts, and went back to their humble lives, shaken but alive. They had played with fire and only singed their eyebrows. But for the sellers, particularly the professional growers, the 3.5% solution was a catastrophe. The flower growers were the only people in this entire chain of insanity who had actually done any work. They had tilled the soil, planted the bulbs, protected them from the frost, and waited patiently for the harvest. They were holding the physical inventory, the gold that everyone had been screaming for. They had signed contracts expecting life-changing wealth, planning to expand their nurseries or retire in comfort. Now, they were left holding thousands of bulbs that nobody wanted, with a handful of loose change as compensation. They had planted assets in the autumn and dug up worthless onions in the spring. While the speculators went back to their workshops, many professional horticulturists faced bankruptcy. They had invested real capital, buying land, tools, and manure, based on the paper promises of the winter. Those promises were now ash. The injustice was staggering. The people who created the value took the loss, while the people who created the bubble walked away. It was a lesson in the mechanics of a bailout that rings true in every century. When the casino burns down, the house tries to save the gamblers, not the staff. The economy did not die, but the trust that greased its gears evaporated. The Dutch Golden Age was built on a foundation of credit and handshakes. A merchant's word was his bond, and a signature was as good as gold. That social capital was decimated. The colleges and the taverns, once raucous clubs of camaraderie and song, fell silent. The wine money dried up, and the innkeepers looked at their empty tables with grim resignation. Men who had toasted each other as fortunes in January now crossed the street to avoid making eye contact in March. The atmosphere in the cities shifted from a manic party to a suspicious, sullen hangover. Every interaction was tainted by the memory of the crash. If a man tried to buy a load of timber or a sack of grain on credit, the seller would look at him with narrowed eyes. "Did you pay your 3.5%? became the unspoken question. The easy flow of capital that had made Amsterdam the richest city in the world seized up. The machinery of trade did not stop, but it ground forward with the screeching sound of metal on metal, lacking the oil of mutual confidence. However, we must correct a common historical myth. Tulip Mania did not destroy the Dutch economy. History books often paint a picture of a nation reduced to rubble, but that is a dramatic exaggeration. The Netherlands was an economic superpower, and the tulip trade, while loud, was a relatively small fraction of its total GDP. While the taverns were imploding, the massive ships of the Dutch East India Company were still sailing to Batavia and Japan. The herring fleets were still hauling in the harvest of the sea. The textile mills in Leiden were still weaving cloth for export. The crash was a transfer of wealth, not a destruction of it. Money moved from the pockets of the idiots to the pockets of the lucky, and then much of it simply vanished because it never really existed in the first place. It was a paper fire. The aristocrats who had treated tulips as a hobby remained rich. The poor who had gambled what they could not afford remained poor. The class structure, which had briefly threatened to invert itself, snapped back into place with a vengeance. The rich stayed rich, the poor stayed poor, and the middle class learned a painful lesson about staying in their lane. Then, the final, cruelest irony arrived with the changing of the seasons. Spring came to the Netherlands in 1637. The frost melted from the canals, the sun broke through the gray clouds, and in the fields outside Haarlem and Alkmaar, the tulips began to bloom. Nature, completely indifferent to the financial ruin of the species that cultivated it, put on a spectacular show. The Semper Augustus opened its petals, displaying the vivid red and white streaks that had cost men their fortunes. The Viceroy bloomed in purple splendor, mocking the men who had traded oxen and ships to possess it. But the reception had changed. A few months earlier, these flowers would have been greeted with gasps of adoration and greed. Now, people looked at them with a visceral hatred. The object of desire had become an object of disgust. There are reports of angry citizens marching into the fields and smashing the flowers with shovels, trampling the beauty into the mud. They could not stand to look at them. The flower was a mirror that showed them their own ugliness, their own greed, and their own stupidity. The bulb was just a bulb. It had no agency, no malice, and no value other than what the human mind projected onto it. It was innocent, but the Dutch could not forgive it for what they had done to themselves. They destroyed the crop not because it was worthless, but because it was a reminder of the madness. The fever had broken, but the patient was left staring at the scars, wondering how irrational people could have lost their minds over a plant. The flowers died in the mud, but the root of the problem, the human capacity for delusion, remained buried deep in the soil, waiting for the next season and the next asset to bloom again. The lawsuits from the crash of 1637 did not end when the flowers died. They dragged on for decades, clogging the municipal courts of Haarlem and Amsterdam like silt in a canal. Magistrates grew old and retired while still presiding over the same arguments between bitter tailors and bankrupt millers, fighting over debts that had long since become imaginary. Eventually, the Dutch simply moved on, not because justice was served, but because they were exhausted. The energy required to sustain the anger cost more than the money they had lost. The nation that emerged from the wreckage was different, harder, colder, and deeply suspicious of easy money. The trauma of the crash rewired the Dutch national character. They transformed from the reckless gamblers of the 1630s into the most conservative, boring investors in Europe. They retreated into a shell of prudence, hoarding their gold in heavy chests and looking at every investment opportunity as a potential trap. This psychological scar manifested in their culture, specifically in their art. The Golden Age masters began to paint a new genre of still life, known as vanitas. In these dark, hyper-realistic oil paintings, you would often see a table clutter with symbols of wealth, a silver goblet, a pearl necklace, and almost always a tulip. But next to the flower, the artist would paint a human skull, or an hourglass with the sand running out, or a piece of rotting fruit. The message was subtle but devastating. Remember, you will die. The tulip, once a symbol of God's glory, had become a symbol of death and the fleeting, pathetic nature of worldly ambition. It was a warning hanging in the dining rooms of the elite. Wealth is temporary, stupid, and ultimately meaningless. If history were science, Tulip Mania would have been the experiment that proved the hypothesis, and humanity would have learned the lesson forever. We would have looked at the destruction of 1637, nodded our heads, and agreed never to mistake a trend for a fundamental truth again. But history is not a science. It is a tragedy that repeats itself on a loop. The Tulip Mania was not a freak accident or a one-time anomaly caused by a specific virus in a specific flower. It was a blueprint. It was the pilot episode of a series that we have been binge-watching for 400 years. In 1720, the British looked at the Dutch and laughed, then promptly lost their minds over the South Sea Company, trading their life savings for shares in a company that sold nothing but the promise of slave trade profits that never materialized. In the 1840s, the British did it again, this time with the railway mania. They laid track to nowhere, building stations in empty fields, convinced that steam engines were a magical technology that justified infinite valuations. The asset changed from a bulb to a ship to a train, but the chart looked exactly the same. In the 1920s, Americans believed that the stock market had reached a permanently high plateau. They bought RCA and Ford on margin, borrowing money to buy stocks that paid no dividends, fueled by the Jazz Age belief that the party would never end. Then came 1929. The ticker tape stopped ticking, and men jumped out of windows on Wall Street. The technology was different, radio and automobiles instead of steam, but the psychology was identical. The new era was just the new tulip. In the late 1990s, we convinced ourselves that the internet had rewritten the laws of economics. We bought shares in companies like Pets.com, businesses that lost money on every sale but made it up in volume. We valued websites based on eyeballs instead of profit. When the dot-com bubble burst, trillions of dollars of wealth evaporated into the digital ether, leaving behind nothing but Herman Miller chairs and useless domain names. We swore we would not get fooled again. Then came 2008. We decided that housing prices could never go down. We bought second homes in Florida with no income and no job, financed by banks that packaged the debt into complex derivatives that no one understood. We called them CDOs instead of futures contracts, but it was just Windhandel with better math. When the housing market collapsed, it nearly took civilization with it. And today, look at the crypto markets, the NFTs of bored monkeys, the meme coins named after dogs. We are trading digital tokens that do nothing, produce nothing, and own nothing, convinced that they are the future of money. Why do we keep doing this? Why, despite all our libraries, our universities, and our supercomputers, are we just as stupid as a 17th century chimney sweep? The answer is that financial bubbles are not about economics. They are about biology. They are driven by the primitive chemistry of the human brain. We are hardwired to seek dopamine, and nothing releases dopamine like the prospect of easy money. We are social animals, terrified of being left behind by the pack. The pain of losing money is bad, but the pain of watching your idiot neighbor get rich while you stay poor is unbearable. That envy overrides the neocortex. It shuts down the logical centers of the brain and hands the controls over to the lizard brain. Intelligence is no defense against this. Sir Isaac Newton, one of the greatest minds in the history of our species, lost a fortune in the South Sea bubble. When asked about it, he famously muttered, "I can calculate the motions of heavenly bodies, but not the madness of people." If the man who discovered gravity could not resist the pull of the bubble, what chance do you have? You're sitting there, watching this, probably thinking that you are smarter than the Dutch. You are laughing at them for trading a house for an onion. But look at your phone. Look at the apps you open every morning. We have not evolved. We just got faster internet. We trade stocks based on Reddit threads. We buy coins because a billionaire tweeted a joke. We call it investing, but let us be honest. It's just the tavern economy on a global scale. The only difference is that the Dutch had to walk to the inn to lose their life savings. You can do it from your toilet. The tragedy of Tulip Mania is not that the flowers were worthless. The tragedy is that the flowers were beautiful, and we ruined them. The tulip was never the villain in this story. The tulip was just a flower doing what flowers do, blooming, dying, and trying to reproduce. It did not ask to be currency. It did not ask to be a status symbol. It was an innocent bystander in a drive by shooting committed by human greed. The villain is the thing that lives in the human heart. It is the whisper that says this time is different. It is the arrogance that believes we have conquered the cycle of boom and bust. It is the blind faith that the line on the chart will go up forever. But the line never goes up forever. Gravity always wins. The reversion to the mean is the only law of the universe that is more powerful than compound interest. So, the next time you see an asset price skyrocketing for no reason, the next time you hear your Uber driver giving you stock tips, the next time you feel that itch to buy something just because everyone else is buying it, stop. Look at the chart. And then close your eyes and picture a frozen canal in Amsterdam in 1637. Picture the silence of the auction house. Picture the man standing on the bridge, staring at the water, realizing that his fortune is gone. The bubble is not history. The bubble is human nature. It is waiting for you right now, hiding in a new disguise, wearing a new suit, speaking a new language. You probably already own it. You are holding it in your portfolio, convinced it's the retirement plan that will set you free. And just like the Dutch sailor in the warehouse, slicing his onion with a knife, you would not know it is worthless until you take a bite and realize it tastes like tears.